Thanks, Emily. And thanks everyone for coming. Really interesting talk so far. I should mention that this is part of a much larger process. We'll be just talking about one little slice of Shoreline, but want to give credit to the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee, or OAK for short. That's their logo on the upper right. Is a larger group that started meeting a few years ago and is looking at a lot of different options kind of around the Alameda, Oakland, Inter-Estuary, San Leandro Bay areas. And so I'll just be talking about one piece today, which is the Bay Farm Island Shoreline Adaptation Project. Um, and these are, the folks that are working on it currently on the lower left here. So CMG is the lead, and Moffett Nickel is the lead on the design for the levee. And so we're ESA working on the nature-based elements for this. Let's go to the next one. So just to give a little bit of the history. So I think this area is really interesting. I think as a lot of folks probably know already, Alameda looked a lot different, both Alameda Island and Bay Farm Island. Bay Farm Island, which we'll talk about today, was primarily a marsh. It did have a small island, but this was something it was actually one of the last big developments out onto the bay before the Coastal Protection Act. So it's not that old. It's 5 or 6 decades old, built onto that former marsh. And Alameda Island, of course, used to be connected to Oakland, kind of where you see the name Alameda. That there was a dredge channel put there, and then San Leandro Bay has been kind of adjusting over time. Um, so we'll be talking about kind of the northern shore of Bay Farm Island. So let's in the next slide, we'll zoom in a little bit. So this is from SFEI looking at the historical ecology, and you can kind of see where the streets are there to kind of get a bit of a reference point. So where we're talking about is mostly from where that 61 Doolittle Drive crosses over the bay as the eastern edge of the project to Seaview Park on the western edge, which is kind of where the shoreline bends towards the northwest. And as I had mentioned, it was primarily marsh for eons before this. There is still a thin strip of marsh there, which we'll talk about a bit, and a little bit of kind of fringing sand estuarine beach on the northwestern facing parts of the shoreline, at least some of them. And important to mention here too that there's a nice historical through line for this site, which is that this is one of the areas that was important for California sea blight, for Sueda californica, one of the main vectors for it, and it's an opportunity area to bring that back to connect to the history there. But anyway, we'll be looking at a bunch of different things, and this just kind of gives you a sense of how this all is connected. Let's go to the next one. So to talk a little bit about what's out there today, I'm going to go from east to west along the shoreline to kind of orient folks. It's kind of how it works in my head, going east to west for some reason. But so where Doolittle Drive crosses over, we have what's that little cutout in the shoreline that's called Veterans Court. Um, it's basically there's a seawall there, which you can see in the kind of in the foreground of the top image, and there's a fringing pickleweed and gum plant marsh along the back edge of that, and then mudflat, and then a bike path that goes over the mouth of it. There's a fishing pier that's kind of in the distance. You can see it better in the image too in the distance. That fishing pier is a littoral barrier, so sand is moving east along the shoreline, and some of it gets trapped there. There's some sandy beaches there now, um, pretty small, but they're forming in what's basically a retreating edge of the fill placement from the 60s and 70s. So going to the next one. Now moving farther west along the site. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, but there's actually an artificial lagoon draining Bay Farm, which comes out kind of in the middle of the site. Yep, right there. And so what we see along a lot of the site is actually kind of what image three looks like. You get this kind of thin strip of pickleweed marsh. Um, some of it is part of the historical marsh platform that still pokes out from the developed shoreline, but it's getting undercut. Um, and you get kind of a small, low, sandy beach in front of it now. And then it's really constrained on the back end by ice plant. And there's a lot of ice plant shoulder throughout this whole site. and then parkland behind that. Um, the image two is just showing you another view of um, kind of the sandy berms you get out there now. And then image one is just showing kind of where the armor stops. Let's actually go to the next slide. That's a good segue. So that image one, the last slide, is showing the area kind of near that second box on the lower image now. So basically, there's armor as you go west. It starts right around where the waves start to get a bit larger as the shoreline starts to face northwest a bit. And that armor is kind of starving that supply of sediment that's moving from west to east throughout the site. And so right after that, you see an erosion hotspot where yeah, exactly right there, where the bay edge is retreating. You get kind of a thin line of gum plant at the top. And then you get these interesting little spots where inside of that number two box there, that's lag material from Bay Farm Island placement. It's about 1 foot in diameter, but it's in a few places it's colonizing with fucus, which is really interesting. There's some fucus that's doing really well out there. And in some of those places where you see that, you actually see less erosion immediately behind them. So kind of a sort of mini reference site of how there could be maybe macroalgal beds that could help with um, not necessarily being a tombolo, but being something that could help retain sediment. And number one there is just showing a kind of a natural ponded area. Not natural, but behind in the marsh strip that's behind the armor. All right, let's go to the next slide. So talking about the vulnerability, uh, you can play that video. Yeah. So I went out and walked the site during the king tide on January 3rd. So the reason why there is a project happening is because the eastern portion of the levee through the site is low and needs to be raised, is already vulnerable. We had a sensor out there during this event. The water levels were up to about 9.1 or so feet NAVD. Um, and so you can see that hitting basically the edge of the swimming pool at the Harbor Bay Club during the peak of the event. Image at the right is the seawall at Veterans Court, and you can see the seawall's at about 9. And so you could see water was just kind of pumping over that. It's kind of scary, but it's one of these things where the shoreline is already vulnerable, and so it's a levee and bay trail improvement project, and we're integrating with that nature-based features in front and throughout. Um, all right, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so this is just a snippet of some of the goals, but I think that some of the Balin's goals for this area are particularly relevant and I think are worth highlighting. This is not going to be a big acreage site. We're not going to restore like 50, 100 acres of tidal marshes or different habitat types. It's really about more connectivity. Right now, we have a fractured ribbon of eroding marsh along the shoreline that's backed by ice plant that's retreating on the front edge. And we're looking for ways that we can augment that, but also increase connectivity along the entire shoreline for the benefit of a lot of species. And I mentioned California sea light earlier. That's a particular focus in this area that we want to integrate. Also, I need to mention that we're right next to San Leandro Bay. San Leandro Bay is still in active management by the ISP project, and so they're going to be doing treatments through I think 2027 and then monitoring for a few years. All of that to say that we have to be extremely careful about Spartina. We wouldn't be able to use it here just because it's a really high risk of hybridization. We're well within the area of influence. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So we looked at a lot of different reference sites, including accidental ones. So uh, basically, if this site is very kind of connected to what's around it. There's just across to the north from it on the Alameda Island is the L.C. Romer Marsh, which is a well-loved bird sanctuary. And and there's just to the west of that is Crown Beach. And what these images on the right are showing are some sand that's gotten around the eastern jetty, the terminal jetty at Crown Beach, and you can see that sand kind of moving in front of the marsh edge at LC Romer. We just looked at that to understand, like, if we were to place sand along the Bay Farm Island shoreline, how do we think that would move? What would be the rates of that? And that's something that we're going to study more. Just we're measuring waves now, but using this site as kind of a surrogate with similar wave climate, seeing how things could happen. Um, all right, so what are we talking about here? I mentioned that it's largely it's a sea level rise adaptation project, so it's raising a low portion of the shoreline is the heart of it, and improving the bay trail on top of that. But what we're doing in and around and in front of that is trying to prevent this ribbon of marsh from fracturing any further, trying to augment it and add connectivity along it by um, adding retention elements. So large, and learning from Aramburu, Sears Point, Heron's Head, a lot of these different sites, but probably a combination of large wood, small groins, macroalgal beds. So can we use rocky intertidal as a way of retaining sediment? And cobble headlands that would also be vegetated, but also trying to place some feeder beaches that would drift east over time, essentially. And as they would start to form these beaches against these retention structures, there we could use the complexity that forms there to add other things. So, adding sea blight at the higher elevations, for example. Um, and we want to reclaim marsh where we can from areas that are currently ice plant. Um, should mention too, so because a lot of this will be backed by a raised levee, what this would also incorporate is upper marsh transition plants behind the beaches that we would essentially restore. Upper marsh transition in front of the toe, in front of and on top of the toe of the levee, basically behind the beach. I think the next image actually shows that a little bit better. So if you look at the lower left one, you can see that's like a raised bay trail there. And so the marsh that's in front of it, this is in a kind of a cartoon format, but what it is now is kind of it's a steep drop off, concave front, like undercutting marsh platform. We would be fronting that with some sort of low beach that would be helped to be locked in place by various features that I mentioned earlier. Um, but behind that, we know where this intersects with the levee, we would be topping the levee toe essentially with upper transition species. This image on the upper part is just this is from CMG. That's kind of adding some color to the different elements together, the levee, the bay trail, but also the living shorelines elements in front. And so um, working with Mario Accordino, Eddie DeVita, Michelle Orr on kind of a concept for how we could retain sediment, including these sort of cobble headlands there that would be vegetated on the upper portions. And then these are just showing some cross sections. This is my last slide here, but or second to last slide, just to show that we don't need to go through all these details. But again, we're trying to learn from lessons that have been. We're trying to pick up from the mini and growing lessons, the rolling snowball from the last 10 years, 20 years, basically, which is kind of exciting, actually. Really like to see this kind of momentum pick up across different sites and in this community. Um, so just ending, as I mentioned earlier, this is a big process with a lot of people involved, and this is just one slice of the shoreline. A lot of really good energy growing around here, so happy to work with all these great people.